Welcome to the EQ Video Tip. I'm your host, Eric Forsetter. As always, thanks again for watching another terrific edition of the EQ Video Tip. Before we jump in, let's review the goals of EQ Video Tip. What's on tap for today? We have a great article from David Brooks, who wrote an article in the New York Times about essential skills for being human. We're going to take a few pieces of that, especially as it regards to how to have a conversation with someone. So many of us think we're great conversationalists, but we don't realize we're actually doing the wrong things when we're talking to someone. We're making them feel bad about themselves, or we're taking the attention away from that person and bringing it to ourselves, as opposed to asking good questions. We're going to jump into some of David's excellent tips on how to be an essential human being in terms of your skills and your relationships when you have conversations. Let's jump in right now. Tip number 1, be a loud listener. Now, that doesn't mean you're yelling at the person talking to you, but instead, sometimes it's okay to say yes or or I agree. Some type of verbal cue that says, hey, I'm actually listening to you and I know what you're saying. Think about a church where someone's yelling affirmations like amen or yes or whatever they might be doing to tell the preacher or the priest that, hey, this is what I believe in. The same thing applies here. Be a loud listener. Someone says something you agree with, say, yeah, that makes sense, or yes, or I agree. Things like that will make the person say, I love talking to this person. So be a loud listener. Tip number 2, storify whenever possible. And when we say storyify, we mean that we want that other person to tell us a story as opposed to their conclusion. So instead of asking something like, what do you think about that? Ask the question, how did you come to believe that? This gives the person an opportunity to tell a story. And when people tell a story, you understand more about their values and their experiences, and they're revealing more about their personal traits that they went through and their personal story or narrative to get to that conclusion. So make sure that you storify whenever possible. Tip number 3, and I love these two combined tips. Do looping, especially when you're talking to an adolescent, and then turn that partner into the actual narrator. So what do we mean by looping? Well, looping is a very simple act of replaying the story back to the narrator. So if someone tells you a story about how they lost their keys, you can replay it back to them and say, oh, you walked in the house, you threw them down somewhere, and it sounds like you didn't know where they were. You're looping back what they say. At the same time, when that happens, what you want to do is turn your partner into a narrator. So how did your mom feel when you lost the keys? Or what was her tone of voice? Or what was your reaction? Was the person screaming at you, or were they just talking to you? Making that person more of a narrator gives them more of an emotional connection and will help you better understand it. So remember to loop back the story, but then at the same time turn that person into the narrator to give you more details as to how that person actually felt or interacted. And this way, you'll have a much richer story. Our last tip, don't be a topper. And that sounds pretty simple, but we all do it. If someone's telling you a story about they're having trouble with something, maybe with a friend or a loved one or a colleague, don't turn around and say, I know exactly how you mean. I've had an incredible problem. The same thing with my friend or my loved one or my boss. Instead, you think you might be building a relationship or a shared bond, but instead what you're doing is you're shifting the attention back to yourself. Instead, ask, how did that make you feel, or how can I support you, or tell me more about it. Again, loop back the story or turn that person into a narrator. Don't try to take your own position as something of theirs as well, because in the end, you're taking away from their story. So remember, don't be a topper. That's a wrap for this week's EQ video tip. Remember, take these tips by David, use them in your day-to-day life as you talk to people and have conversations. Remember, not every conversation is going to be perfect, but take your time to use these tips and customize them to the best of your ability so that you're able to have better conversations.
So that concludes our EQ video tip for today. Try incorporating some of these tips into your daily routine. But remember, use what works best for you and personalize it for yourself. Thank you always to our great research team for providing us with some great tips today. As always on EQ Video Tip, we want to end with gratitude. So thank you for watching. We really appreciate it. Here are some resources that you can use if you want more information on EQ going forward. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you.